Hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the CAE Forum. My name's Greg Miles. I'm the program champion of cyber studies at the University of Advancing Technology. We're out of Tempe, Arizona. In our cyber program, we have cybersecurity, network engineering, and technology forensics as part of our program. We have been CAE designated for 2 cycles now, and we're coming up for our CAE redesignation in 2020. And so we're looking forward to that with the new process also. I am not a graphic design artist. You will see that in my presentation. But I am an educator that's passionate about cyber and cybersecurity education. Some of my students are watching this right now, and I appreciate them taking the time out of their busy schedules, just as I appreciate you guys taking the time out of yours. So what I'm going to be focusing on in the short time that I have is just talking about really wanting to get the education process to assure that we include business considerations in what we're doing with security and compliance. Because without those business considerations, we're going to run into where we're implementing security without having a foundation and a basis to do that. And that can get very expensive over time, can get very confusing for the organization. A lot of time it gets your funding cut as an organization. I have experience, I've been with UAT for 14 years. 30 years in the IT and cybersecurity industry. So I've seen where things have failed due to the lack of this information. So I'm going to base this discussion on that. And so we'll go ahead and proceed. Let me see if I do have control. Anastasia, would you mind assisting with the slides? I cannot get it to advance.
Did you click the screen?
I did. I'll try it again. So let's talk about what makes methodology successful. First and foremost, it has to be comprehensive. You have to make sure the methodology covers the full gambit of what the business operations that you're addressing security for. And so you have to be able to pull in multiple different regulations, different compliance pieces, different interests, different business objectives in order to successfully implement a good methodology. And then along with that is flexibility. The methodology has to be flexible enough to be adjusted in order for the business that you're working in, whether it's technology, whether it's financial business, or even a university. So comprehensive and flexible are the 2 primary areas that your methodology must be. It needs to be well documented as well, and I didn't put that on there, but that's kind of one of those underlying things that it must be. Every security program has to relate back to the business operations, and this is really the whole intent of my presentation, is a real focus on the business needs of the organization. It includes not only your security objectives, which in the cyber community, we talk a lot about that, but it also includes your compliance objectives and what the organization needs to be compliant with. And then, of course, it has to include your business objectives, because without the business objectives, you're trying to build a program that you don't know what you're basing that on. You don't know what you're trying to protect. And so just a question that I ask, is everything beyond this gravy or a waste of money? Well, it's one of those answers that is, it depends. And we'll address that a little bit further as we go. Okay, I do finally have control. Thank you, Anastasia. So what I'd like to introduce, if you haven't seen this before, is the vulnerability discovery triad. Um, I I worked with National Security Agency with their INFOSEC assessment and INFOSEC evaluation methodologies for several years. I was one of the authorized instructors for that. And so they defined that 3 levels that we talk about when we look at the vulnerability discovery triad. Assessments, which is the level 1, and really the assessment side is an organizational approach, really not focusing on the technical, running security scans or analyzing specific systems for protection, that type of thing. It's really the higher level, the big picture. And when we talk about business operations, that's the big picture. That's where you're starting from as you're building out your methodologies for the assessment and security within the organization. It's a cooperative high-level overview. It is, a key word here is cooperative. And so when you're doing an assessment, you're doing it based on trying to help an organization to improve their environment. It's all based on the information that's critical to the organization, the mission that's critical to the organization, what they've defined as important to them. It includes looking at policy and procedures and information flow. You're not really looking at conducting hands-on testing in a pure assessment process. The second level of this is the evaluations. This is where you're actually doing hands-on testing, but you're looking at the systems, the network, and the environment based on mission criticality that has been defined in the level 1 assessment. That helps you to prioritize your systems, and in the end, when you find vulnerabilities, it helps you to prioritize fixing those vulnerabilities when you do your final report. Still cooperative. It's not a methodology where you are yet doing any kind of red teaming or social engineering or penetration testing where you're playing the part of the bad guy. There is a difference in the level of expertise that's required for these 2 types of things. The assessment level 1, the expertise is based on having a good knowledge of business functions, policy procedure, how that's all managed. Technical evaluations, you got to have a few more technical skills, the ability to understand what the scanning tools are providing in terms of information and how that can relate back to the organization, because you've got to do detailed analysis of those technical results. And then the third piece of this is the red team. That is where you get to be adversarial. You get to play the part of the bad guy. You can do external penetration tests. You can do internal penetration testing. You can do social engineering. You can, employ a whole gambit of possible attack type scenarios, depending on the scope of what you've arranged with the organization. And so those are the 3 levels. Those are the vulnerability discovery triad. And if you look at this fancy slide, that kind of puts it into the triangle, since we have a triad, with the assessment as the basis. And again, the assessment's where we find out what the business operations and needs are. With the evaluation is looking at the technical piece. The red team gets an adversarial view. And these are things that you want to repeat over time. And just looking at it from a more generic standpoint, the organizational view, the technical view, and then you're emulating threat. And for any Harry Potter fans out there, we understand the power of the triangle. So if we take another look, so risk we define as the combined effect of threats, vulnerabilities, and impact. And so that's another view of the triangle when we look at risk, which we look at quite a bit in the cyber community. So as I said, the organizational process is used to define and understand the business processes. This information comes from the leadership of the organization. That's where it has to start. It may be documented within an organization. There may be public facing pieces of information that are out there, but there's also probably internal drivers that get built into the business processes and the business operations needs. You also have compliance requirements. In my career, I've helped many organizations help to define their compliance requirements. If they haven't sat down and done a process, an organizational process like I'm presenting, they oftentimes have missed pieces of their requirements because there's the potential for so many out there. And so the business process review, along with the building and the compliance requirements, governance requirements, that provides the organization a bigger picture of what they've got to do in order to have security built in to their organization. We're really trying to understand the business goals and the objectives, what they need to perform the business functions, what are the stakeholder needs as well. There are a lot of external drivers that businesses have to deal with when they are implementing security programs or managing their security programs. So define and document the impact and thresholds within the business operations. So what do we mean by impact? Well, impact can be broken out. The easiest form is like a high, medium, and low impact, and many of you have probably seen that before, where you may have, if I have downtime of my network that that is up to 1 hour, that's a low impact to my business operations. If it's 4 hours, up to 4 hours, that's a medium impact. Anything over 4 hours may be high impact. Depending on the organization, they're going to have different definitions for those different pieces of that, of what impact means to them. And so it's difficult to take some of the generic impacts that are out there. NIST has made a good attempt at generic impacts, but you've really got to tailor the impacts to your specific organization to fully understand what can happen to your organization if something bad happens. And that helps to define your priorities, how you define business continuity, et cetera. So with the organizational process, you're looking at identifying and documenting the systems that process, transmit, and or store critical business information. And so this will be help with the definition of what your critical systems are. In the organizational process, we're still not testing those, but by defining them, they help us to define the targets for the technical activities. One of the critical things that you have to do with the organizations is to define what are their security objectives. What is the security posture objective? Where do they need to be? Where do they want to be? And if you look at this graphic, likely we're going to be defining organizational security posture objectives in the low risk area. When you do your reviews, you probably find that they're not meeting the objectives at this point, so they're at a higher risk. And the difference between that is simply the gap. So that's your gap analysis, and that's what you're going to be focusing on or helping the organization focus on in order to improve their security posture. And that's the key point here too. You can do all the work in the world, but if an organization doesn't take steps to then improve their security posture, then you have failure of the process. So they've got to make improvements, whether those improvements are mitigation, removing the vulnerabilities, or even accepting the risks that comes along with certain vulnerabilities. Those are taking steps to acknowledge they have some level of risk and trying to improve their security posture. So when you're doing your organizational review, you're looking at a full range of documentation and actions. So anything you can think of that has any relationship to technology operations and security operations, you want to pull into this process. Security, the overall security program, guidance documents, incident response, crisis management, business continuity, change control, all those apply as things that you would review in terms of the methodology. Education, training, and awareness are key points of review. How do they handle that within an organization? What are the annual testing procedures, or more frequent if they've got really sensitive information, or compliance requirements that force them to do additional types of or more frequent testing? How's the organization determine the threats that affect them? A lot of times they're just guessing what the threats are, and a little bit we have to guess. But if I'm a big company, say like Amazon, could be a target for industrial espionage just because I'm a big target. If I'm a small company, mom and pop shop down on the corner, probably less likely. But at the same time, it might be easier for an attacker to attack the mom and pop shop that really doesn't have much in the way of security built in, as opposed to going after Amazon, depending on what the threats goals are. And so you have to look at the threats from the business side as well, as to see what the potential threat actors are to your organization. You also have natural threats and concerns. If you have a business on the Big Island in Hawaii right now, you've got some serious concerns as to your ability to continue operations, but also the safety and security of your personnel. So those are all considerations that have to go into it, is to include the threat and get the organization to sign off on those concepts. So the organizational process is really taking the critical business information and impacts, compliance and governance requirements, determining what the gap is, and put together your plans and actually implement your plans for improving the security and closing the gap. And of course, it is a life cycle. It keeps going and going. That is what we obviously try to project. We know that security is not a one-time deal. It is a continuous process within organizations, and it has to be that way. Here are some of the components. I'm not going to read these to you. You've got them there. But this should look fairly familiar if you're familiar with the NIST documentation through NIST special publication 800-53. All those areas are included in those considerations. And then there's a great deal of detail that goes into each of these areas and the subcategories that fall into it. So from an organizational perspective, you're worried about policy, procedure, et cetera, that relate to these major topics. So then let's look at the technical process. So the organizational process feeds the technical process. As I mentioned, we identify and prioritize the systems based on criticality through the organizational process. Then we can use those as targets and for the priorities that are defined for the systems, and identify the vulnerabilities that can affect the business operations for the critical operations of the organization. For this process, this is where you can do your technical vulnerability testing, technical penetration testing, physical penetration testing, computer forensics, analysis and processes, network device analysis are just some of those considerations. In the NSA's INFOSEC evaluation methodology, they had defined 10 areas that were kind of the minimum number of components that you would test. As technology changes, this list has and will change. And plus, you can add to this based on, again, the concept of flexibility. You will adjust the list based on the needs as you're doing these types of reviews. So again, just a brief snapshot of some of the things that are included in the technical testing process. And then, of course, you've got to watch things, because no matter how much effort we put in to the organizational and the technical and implementing fixes to the vulnerabilities, more vulnerabilities pop up over time. We can't eliminate all vulnerabilities, and we always have that factor called humans that will have can have both a positive and negative effect on your security posture. So we have to assume something's going to happen. And so we have to monitor in a continuous manner both the business operations, security operations, the technical systems. All those have to be monitored as part of your continuous process. Where you get that information from, all of us are probably familiar with, all the network devices and the log capabilities there, critical technical systems, firewalls, intrusion detections, and intrusion prevention systems all feed into that as well. And so having a good foundation of monitoring and the good documentation on how to respond to things that are identified is a critical part of this overall continuous methodology. And then you have to test it. You have to test what you've defined. You've got to test your incident response. You've got to test your business continuity, disaster recovery. You got to test your technical, so frequent vulnerability scans and remediation. Depending on the criticality, a lot of times you can do a monthly scan just to keep up with things. SANS top 20 reviews, all those would fit into that as well. And then you get into periodic red teaming, penetration testing, social engineering, probably more on the lines of an annual basis, again, unless you are in a highly critical business type of function. And so just a brief summary, the organization, technical, and threat emulation, they closely tie together because we're trying to accomplish our business needs, our security needs, our compliance needs, and our governance needs. The foundation of all this is the organizational process that maps the business requirements and impacts to the organization so that we understand what we're trying to protect. In the foundation there is, what are we trying to protect? We conduct the gap analysis to show our strengths and weakness, and then we monitor and test. And so I welcome any questions, and thank you again for the opportunity.